Hi. This video is about Chapter 18. It's our first video from Chapter 18, and I don't think Chapter 18 is terribly difficult, so a lot of what I'm going to be doing here I'm going to call trade details, because they're just little bits that I think the book could do a better job on. So you should be reading the book, you should be doing some problems, but here I'll help you out with some things. Okay? First off, let's start with the beginning of the book. It gives a couple pie charts. Okay, this is on the third page of the chapter. Pie charts are a terrible tool for getting correct information, but what can we do? We got to run with what we have. They've made this worse by tilting these pie charts. That's something graphic artists do to basically screw up the thinking of students, and unfortunately there is not much we can do about that, so we just, again, have to live with it. Okay? All right, so this tells us where U.S. exports are going and where U.S. imports are coming from. It does not tell us that imports are larger than exports. That's something you have to get from some other source. That's one of the senses in which pie charts are not very good. Not surprisingly, our biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico, okay, our closest neighbors. They have very, very recently been eclipsed by China. Okay, but the thing is with China, it's heavily tilted towards imports. Their exports are much smaller. So you have to compare both of them. So is 20% and 8%, how does that compare to 13 and 18%? Or how does that compare to 14 and 16%? It's safe to say that given the sort of mismeasurement that you have in macroeconomic data, just because you're talking about countries and they're very, very large, that you could view the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, and the U.S. and China as being about the same size as trading partners. Okay, we do trade with the whole rest of the world. Okay, a lot with the European Union, a lot with the Pacific Rim. That's basically all the countries in Asia or in East Asia except China. Okay. Americans tend to get a little bit buggy about trade with OPEC for oil, but you can see that that's actually a fairly small sliver right there. Okay. All right. Next up, I want to go over to the page previously where there is this table right here, okay, which shows the export to GDP ratio and the import to GDP ratio for various countries. And you can see that there are some countries in which trade is very important, like the Netherlands, and other countries in which trade is unimportant, like the United States. I want you to note before I go away from this table that Canada is quite high on this table. So why is Canada high and why is the United States low? That's a question I want to get at in these trade details. All right, so unfortunately, when we talk about trade, most people tend to forget the single biggest, most important thing about trade, which is you trade with people that are close by. Okay. They also tend to forget the second biggest thing about trade, which is you trade with people who are like you. Okay, so if you think about your situation, you do most of your trade with someplace like Walmart or Smith's because it's close by. And you know what? Walmart and Smith's employ a lot of people like you to buy products that you're going to like. So it's kind of like shopping at your friends almost. Those are the two most important determinants of trade. Unfortunately, people get into all sorts of weird, bizarre beliefs about trade, which just do not hold water at all, and they cling to these very, very tightly. So let's talk about that a little bit in terms of a map. So I've got this atlas off my shelf right here, and it's too big to actually fit in one image on your screen, so I'm going to take my phone off and move it around. But what I've got here is a political map of the globe. So there's Asia, there's Europe, going across to the other side of the page, there's the United States over there. Now, the sense in which we trade most with our neighbors gets us into trouble, because if you look, we have two neighbors, okay, Canada and Mexico, and that's it. You might call the little Central American countries our neighbors, but yeah, probably not so much. Contrast that with Western Europe, where all the countries have lots of neighbors. I'm going to try and focus that a little bit better. Okay, and it's not really cooperating. Okay, which means that you should not be surprised that Europeans trade a lot more than Americans do because they have lots of neighbors. Okay, if we go over to East Asia over here, okay, the countries have less neighbors, but as we all know, this is the most populous part of the globe, so there's a lot more trading opportunities over here. Another thing that Americans don't tend to know very well is that all of these seas on the west side of the Pacific are fairly shallow, fairly calm, easy for shipping. So the heaviest shipping routes for over a century have been right through here because the ships don't get wrecked. This is not the North Atlantic over here. The Western Pacific is very calm and very reasonable almost all year long, except for the occasional typhoon. Okay, so there's our first point is Americans don't trade that much because we don't have very many neighbors, okay? The other reasons we don't trade is Mexico is not exactly like us. Now, Americans tend to underestimate Mexico, but around the rest of the world, Mexico is considered a fairly large country. It's in the top 15 as far as GDP goes. It's not much smaller than Russia as far as GDP goes. And Mexico has done quite well over the last 40 years or so, other than a hiccup in the 90s there. All right, but the thing is, Mexicans do not make as much as Americans do, so that reduces the opportunities for trade. And there's only a third of the people in Mexico as there are in the United States, and that reduces the possibilities of trade as well. And then we have Canada up here, which is like a carbon copy of the United States in a lot of respects, except 1/10 of the people. So for them to be next to the United States, they've got huge trade opportunities going southward, whereas we don't have very many trade opportunities going northward because there just aren't that many people. Okay, so given those two rules of trade, trade with your neighbors and trade with people like you, if I can bring this table back over here, put my phone back on its stand, okay, we see that Canada trades a lot because they can have a third of their economy dependent on the United States, which is just to the south, okay? If the United States trades with Canada a lot, it's a small proportion of our economy because they're 1/10 of our size. And we already know over from the pie charts here that Americans do export a ton to Canada. It's our biggest trading partner, something like $500 billion. But the thing is, $500 billion out of 20,000 is not really very much. 500 out of 1,799 up here is huge. All right. You also see here that Mexico is not on the list at all. Okay, that's because Mexico is a smaller economy, and you know what? Mexico's like the United States. It doesn't have a lot of neighbors. Same thing with Canada. On the other hand, we look to Western Europe, we look to the Netherlands, their whole economy is trade. We look at Germany, half of their economy is trade. We look at Italy, a third of their economy is trade. France, a third of their economy is trade. The United Kingdom, a little bit less, and you know why? Because they're across the English Channel, and it's that much more of a pain in the neck to actually trade with their neighbors, okay? Surprisingly for Americans, Japan is really low on the list, but that makes a lot of sense if you remember these two rules of trade. Again, I have to pull this off, okay, and I can get the image in here. Japan is over here. Yes, it does have neighbors on the west side, but it's got no neighbors on the east side over here, okay? So Japan actually has fairly limited trade because it's an island country kind of isolated from others. In America, we have this weird idea that the Japanese trade all the time. It's a very insular country. They happen to trade with the United States because we have stuff they want, they have stuff we want, okay? All right, that's enough for this video. Let's stop right there, and I'll talk to you in another video.